We want to switch gears here to another very important issue in the Americas, and that is the ongoing, very brutal blockade of Cuba, especially the elements that we have seen that the United States has placed Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list a few years back, which made it even worse than it already was. We are very honored to be joined here as we continue the show by Kyla Walsh, who is the co-chair of the National Network on Cuba. Kyla, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Can you guys hear me okay?
We sure can. I want to just start with this issue. You all are waging a campaign at the NNOC to get Cuba off of the state sponsors of terrorism list. I think when I think of the word state sponsors of terrorism, it just sounds like completely ridiculous that Cuba would be on this list. But maybe for those who have never heard anything about this, why has the U.S. labeled Cuba like this, and what is the impact?
Yeah, so we should go back to the history of the state sponsors of terrorism list, which was created by war criminal Ronald Reagan, who added Cuba and other countries that are enemies of U.S. imperialism to this list. And the reason Cuba was put on it was because of its support for national liberation movements against colonialism around the world. And Cuba was kept on this list until the Obama era of rapprochement with Cuba, and his administration assessed that there was no evidence justifying Cuba's continued designation on this list. And being designated a state sponsor of terrorism, despite the fact that this list is only maintained by the US government, it is still one of the most serious legal designations that a country could have, because it limits financial transactions, makes it harder for countries to engage in trade and get loans, because these other countries are scared of being punished by the US for violating its sanctions. So Obama removed Cuba from this list, but on January 11th, 2021, this was just days after the Capitol insurrection and the very last weeks of the Trump administration, Trump and his neoconservative Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, put Cuba back on the list. And during his campaign, Biden promised to revert to Obama-era Cuba policy, but he has made zero changes, and he's instead, continued regime change operations in Cuba, demonized the Cuban Revolution, and doubled down on his idea that Cuba is somehow a state sponsor of terrorism. When the Biden administration talks about the state sponsor of terrorism list, very rarely do they mention any actual evidence that Cuba is a state sponsor of terror, because pretty much all the reasons that they list for it are complete bogus. One of the main accusations is that Cuba is a terrorist because it held peace talks between Colombia and the ELN guerrillas, but Cuba has been praised around the world for its role in negotiating that peace. And Colombia's current progressive government has demanded Cuba be removed from the list. And now they're even asking Cuba to host more of these peace talks. So we know that, all these reasons are bogus. Even State Department officials from the George Bush era have admitted that is made up, and it is used to justify continuing the blockade.
And just to point out, we're being told that a few hours ago, Anthony Blinken actually said that there are no plans to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. And it really is mind-boggling why Biden has refused to revert to any of his Democratic predecessors' policies when he was actually vice president. The only thing that comes to mind is maybe there's that much of an obsession with getting the sort of anti-Cuba Miami vote, which is just, very crude political maneuvering in the United States. But can you lay out what does this do to Cuba? I mean, it obviously makes the blockade much, much worse. So can you give us an idea of how this just ends up harming your average Cuban?
Yeah, so the blockade is, as we all know, already extremely harmful to Cuba. It's stolen hundreds of billions of dollars from the Cuban economy over the past over 60 years that the blockade has been in place. And the blockade is a combination of hundreds of different pieces of legislation. It is codified into law by Congress. And so we're focusing on the state sponsor of terrorism list because Biden could change this with the stroke of a pen. And we really want to put public pressure on him about this because it is exacerbating all the effects of the blockade, which are causing fuel shortages in Cuba, food shortages, makes it very hard to buy essential products, medicines, so that Cuba has had to innovate a lot of its own medicines. During COVID, the US blocked Cuba from buying syringes for vaccines and oxygen respirators and so much more. And of course, the US wants us to think that these hardships are caused by socialism, but if you actually look at the situation, if you talk to people in Cuba, These hardships are caused by the blockade and Cuba's socialist system, and their planning that is oriented towards meeting the needs of the people is the reason why Cuba still has better health outcomes, education outcomes, social outcomes, and a more equal society than the U.S., despite being so much poorer because of the blockade. And I want to touch quickly on what happened today. It's interesting we chose this day to do an interview because one of the first times the Biden administration has spoken on the state sponsors of terrorism list recently was just a couple hours ago. Secretary Blinken was in a hearing, and this right-wing Cuban-American Congresswoman, Maria Salazar, who represents Miami, asked Blinken if there was any movement in the State Department to remove Cuba from the list, as some rumors have suggested. And to take a step back, Maria Salazar is a Cuban-American politician. She was actually much more friendly to Cuba when she was a journalist, but she quickly realized, being very loudly anti-communist, anti-Cuba is quite profitable and helpful for a political career in Miami. So now she is just completely owned by the extreme right. And she is introducing this bill to codify Cuba's state sponsors of terrorism designation into law so that the president would not be able to reverse it, that it would be up to Congress and make it virtually impossible to ever reverse this designation. So she asked Blinken about whether he was going to remove Cuba from the list, and he completely doubled down on the designation, said there are no plans to take Cuba off the list right now, and that Cuba would have to meet a very high bar in order to change the designation. And of course, he mentioned zero evidence for Cuba supporting any kind of terrorism, which shows that it is not based in fact. It is a completely political designation to demonize Cuba and isolate Cuba internationally. And I think someone really needs to ask, Biden and Blinken, that if they are doubling down on Cuba's designation as a terrorist state, does that mean they think Obama was wrong to change the designation? Has Cuba suddenly, started supporting terrorism in the years since the Obama administration? It just doesn't make sense. But we will not stop organizing until Biden changes his position and takes Cuba off the list and ends the blockade.
There's an element of perversity to this in a way because Cuba has been a major victim of terrorism. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that because I think it's sort of an unknown history for many people here in the United States.
Yeah, Cuba has long time been a victim of U.S. terrorism for hundreds of years. This goes back to when the U.S. intervened in the Cuban War of Independence, when Cuba was getting freedom from Spanish colonialism. The U.S. started a military occupation of Cuba, and up until 1959, when the July 26th movement won the Cuban Revolution, Cuba was ruled by direct U.S. military occupation and U.S. neocolonialism, under which there was extreme poverty, extreme political corruption, no democracy, no representation, a Jim Crow era racist segregation. And that's why so hypocrite talks about, a supposed lack of democracy in Cuba, is this was the actual reality when the U.S. ruled Cuba. And since the revolution, the U.S. has tried in many ways to overthrow and undermine the revolution, which has led to the deaths of thousands of Cubans, not just through economic warfare like the blockade and this designation as a state sponsor of terror, but also spending hundreds of billions of dollars on CIA intervention, on direct military intervention like the Bay of Pigs. The worst plane hijacking and the worst plane terrorist attack in the Western Hemisphere before 9/11, which, the U.S. loves to use as reasons to attack other countries, was actually a U.S.-backed plane bombing that was led by Cuban exiles and killed over 70 people and passengers from Cuba and other countries. There are hotel bombings during the special period in the 90s, and many direct, terrorist attacks by Cuban exiles that were funded and helped plan by the CIA. And that is why it's so hypocritical that the U.S. accuses Cuba of being a terrorist, because we know very well that the U.S. is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. The U.S. is the only country that has over 800 military bases around the world. And the U.S. Slaps this terrorist designation on any countries that dare to defy U.S. hegemony, and also against its own citizens that are struggling against oppression at home. We see that with the arrest of dozens of forest protectors and protesters in Atlanta and their designation as domestic terrorists for resisting Cop City and protecting trees from getting cut down. They're so-called terrorists because the U.S. does not have any real meaning of this word. They just weaponize it to demonize countries like Cuba that are actually trying to build a better future for our world.
It's so interesting too, because if you look at polling, I mean, a lot of times it's viewed as, oh, there's this like really a strong Cuban voting bloc in Florida that everybody constantly has to appeal to. And that's what Biden is doing. But actually, when you poll like Cubans, younger Cubans are not in America, don't actually support the blockade. Maybe the most vocal, loud ones at protest, like at like right wing protests, seem like they speak for everybody, but they don't actually. So, not that not that politics is a justification to strangle a country. It's not. But I mean, I guess this is more like, let's speculate, but why? Like why continue this blockade until now? When is it really politically necessary for Biden to win Florida, if he even can, if when you poll Cubans, like a lot of Cubans don't support the blockade?
The reason the blockade, continues is very clear. Fidel said this himself. This is what the U.S. cannot forgive, that Cuba has carried out a socialist revolution right under the nose of the United States. So while the U.S. is punishing Cuba with much harsher policies than even other socialist countries, it is because of Cuba's proximity to the U.S. and the example that it shows. We have been taught our entire lives in the US that free healthcare, free education, a life free from economic exploitation is impossible and we'll never have it. People in the US realize that it is actually possible and has been realized just 90 miles away from our shore. Of course, we'd be demanding those same things here. And, there are certainly very loud anti-Cuba voices in Miami. We saw that just during the baseball game there on Sunday, where the Cuban representatives were violently attacked by these Cuban Americans who are more supportive of the U.S. empire than they are of the actual Cuban people. But we're seeing the tide changing. A lot of Cubans who fled to Miami after the revolution were, the higher classes, the people whose property had been expropriated and redistributed by the revolutionary government. But now most of the immigration from Cuba is because of the economic devastation caused by the blockade. And there is a large and growing movement of Cuban Americans who say that, these right-wingers in Miami do not represent all of us. There's a movement, Puentes de Amor, building bridges of love between Cuba and the US and trying to end the blockade because, this blockade is not just a blockade of trade, it is a blockade of people-to-people contact. And it's a blockade of families and culture and Cuban food and music and all of Cuba's amazing contributions to history that we are deprived of because of this violent and inhumane blockade.
Kala, for those who are thinking you're making a lot of sense about this Cuba being listed on the state sponsors of terrorism and the overall impact of the blockade, what can they do to take action on those issues?
Yeah, so we are building a strong and growing movement against the blockade in support of Cuba, against the state sponsors of terrorism list. And I think what's really unique about our campaign is that it's uniting so many different sectors of US society, so many different organizations that may have different but can unite around this issue of ending the blockade. And we're not just explicitly socialist or communist or revolutionary organizations. We're parts of all different sectors of US society who agree the blockade is cruel and inhumane and that we will all benefit from normalizing relations with the US and Cuba. So I encourage people to check out our website, nnoccuba.org, and our social media. We have lots of different activities. We have monthly standouts and caravans against the blockade. Those are happening this weekend. You can check out our social media to find one near you. We're doing lots of public education around debunking US propaganda about Cuba. Just last week, we had a national call into the White House in which over 150 groups participated, making calls to tell Biden to take Cuba off the list. We have congressional advocacy and protests. I want to shout out Code Pink, one of our member orgs. 5 of their members were arrested yesterday protesting Blinken's war hawkishness and policy towards Cuba. We're also passing resolutions in labor unions and in city councils and state legislatures around the country. Over 77 resolutions have passed, which represent over 50 million US people. And we're also building towards a large protest in DC on June 25th, which will be paired with local actions around the country. And this is focused on getting Cuba off the list, but also lifting up the struggles to get, Syria, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Iran, which are the other countries listed on the terrorist list, because all these struggles are interconnected. And Cuba is an example of real internationalism and solidarity between all these struggles against US imperialism around the world. So We encourage people to get involved of all ages, of all backgrounds. I'm 18 and I'm one of the leaders of our organization, so there should be no barriers to people getting involved. And also traveling to Cuba is one of the best ways to learn about it. So check out our pages for all more information about those great opportunities.
Right on. 18 years old. Very impressive.
18. I know that had me go, what? That's amazing. That's amazing.
Well, definitely people should check out NNOC.org. Calla Walsh, co-chair of the National Network on Cuba. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.